Tonight on Boring Owl, we're going to take a soft, meandering stroll through one of those strange corners of history that feels almost made for late-night curiosity.
It's the kind of story that sounds dramatic at first, until you realize it's really just another case of the past being, well, the past. A little chaotic, a little naive, and somehow always charming in its own clumsy way.
You might be familiar with a certain chocolate bar, one wrapped in brown paper, smelling faintly of childhood, lunchboxes, and the candy aisle. But long before it became that familiar little square of sweetness we know today, it had a very different personality, a more energetic personality.
The sort of personality that made people say, "Wow, this treat really wakes you up," without entirely understanding why. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the world had a very enthusiastic relationship with anything considered invigorating.
If something seemed like it could boost your mood, your productivity, or your general sense of being alive, people were interested. The science of the era had a charming optimism. If it came from a plant, it must be good for you.
And so, through a combination of global trade, enthusiastic experimentation, and a surprising lack of strict rules, certain lively botanical extracts found their way into everything from medical tonics to afternoon snacks. Chocolate was no exception.
Of course, before your imagination runs away, this isn't a scandalous tale. Nobody at Hershey's sat around cackling over secret ingredients. It was simply the norm. The formulas used in early chocolate, and in many foods at the time, were built on the best knowledge people had. And that knowledge was, let's say, still warming up. People genuinely thought a little extra pep was good for the body and soul. So when early chocolate had a certain reputation for being stimulating, it wasn't whispered about, it was advertised.
Tonight, we're going to gently wander through that world. The factories, the formulas, the misunderstandings, and the gradual realization that maybe not everything labeled as nature's gift belonged in a candy bar.
We'll watch as science slowly catches up, regulators put on their reading glasses, and chocolate companies, including Hershey, quietly adjust their recipes into the mellow treats we recognize today. But don't worry, we'll take our time. Nothing here is urgent. Nothing is sharp or loud or alarming.
This is history softened at the edges, told slowly enough that if your eyelids begin feeling pleasantly heavier, that's perfectly fine. That's sort of the point.
So breathe out, let the quiet settle, and let Boring Owl guide you into a calmer state as we explore the oddly energetic origins of one of America's favorite chocolates. Whenever you're ready, we'll begin our journey into the past.
Just float along, let the details unfold gently, and enjoy the slow drift of the story. If you really want to understand how a chocolate bar ended up with such an energetic past life, you have to step back into a world that barely resembles ours.
It wasn't just a different time. It was practically a different universe. The 19th century was a place where everything smelled faintly of coal smoke, ambition, and accidental discoveries.
People were inventing things faster than anyone could study them. Cities were growing faster than anyone could organize them. And food was being processed faster than anyone could ask, "Hold on, what exactly is in this?"
You can almost picture the era as a kind of hurried parent who meant well but didn't always remember to read the fine print. To set the scene properly, imagine walking down a street in the late 1800s. There might be a bakery on one side, a blacksmith clanging away on the other, and somewhere between the two, a storefront selling an astonishing variety of medicinal wonders. People would wander in, point to a bottle with enthusiastic labels like "invigorates the blood" or "puts spring in the step,"
and simply trust that whatever was inside was exactly what they needed after a long day. There were tonics for nerves, tonics for digestion, tonics for mood, tonics for stamina.
And if you asked what was inside them, the shopkeeper might smile and say something vague like, "Oh, just the finest botanicals," as though that settled the matter. This was a world where science was blossoming, but regulation was still a polite suggestion. Laboratories were popping up everywhere, some staffed by brilliant chemists, and others by individuals whose main qualifications included enthusiasm and access to a mortar and pestle.
When newspapers ran stories about scientific discoveries, people read them with the same excitement that modern audiences reserve for celebrity gossip. A new plant extract discovered in South America? Fascinating. It boosts alertness? Even better. Let's put it in something edible and see what happens. And into this enthusiastic, slightly chaotic world walked cocoa. Cocoa had been around for centuries, of course, but the industrial era gave it a new life. Suddenly, it wasn't just something for the wealthy or the adventurous.
It was becoming a mass product, an everyday pleasure. Factories were figuring out how to grind it, mix it, sweeten it, and shape it into bars that could survive transportation and storage. People loved the smell, the taste, and the way it made them feel just a little more awake.
Chocolate became a treat, an indulgence, and, depending on who you asked, a sort of natural tonic of its own. It didn't take long for inventive minds to start thinking, well, if chocolate already feels nice and comforting, wouldn't it be even better with a few helpful additions?
And so began an era where food and medicine blurred together in the most ambiguous way possible. People weren't trying to be reckless, they were simply exploring.
They were curious, optimistic, and maybe a little too trusting of anything that promised to give them an edge in a world moving at a dizzying pace. But before Hershey ever entered the picture, chocolate itself had already developed a reputation.
Early advertisements described it as strengthening, fortifying, uplifting. Doctors recommended it for patients who needed nourishment or a pick-me-up. Newspapers praised it as a healthy treat in a time when health covered a very broad spectrum of ideas. And in this swirling atmosphere of confidence and creativity, you can start to see how chocolate became the perfect candidate for experimental enhancements. Meanwhile, America itself was transforming.
Railroads cut across the landscape like veins, carrying goods, people, and ideas to places that had barely heard of each other a decade earlier. Factories hummed with noise and ambition.
Cities swelled with newcomers who hoped that somewhere in all this noise they might find a chance at a better life. There was a national appetite for invention, anything that might help people work harder, think faster, or stay awake longer. Food manufacturers, never ones to miss an opportunity, leaned into this cultural moment. If a product could be marketed as energizing or invigorating, it was practically guaranteed to sell. And so began the quiet, widespread tradition of adding various plant-derived stimulants into everyday goods, often in tiny amounts and with very little concern from the public. This wasn't shocking or controversial. This was simply how things were. There's something almost sweetly innocent about it, in a way, this collective belief that nature's gifts, when processed creatively, could solve almost any inconvenience. Need more pep in the morning? Have a cup of specially formulated cocoa. Feeling sluggish after lunch? Try this refreshing beverage. Studying late into the evening? Here's a tonic that promises clarity of mind. And while people genuinely felt the effects, they rarely questioned why. It just seemed like magic, or at least something close to it. And then, through the swirl of this energetic, optimistic world, a young man named Milton Hershey quietly began his journey. Long before his name became synonymous with chocolate bars and factory towns, he was simply another ambitious dreamer observing the world around him. He saw how rapidly people's tastes were changing. He saw how industrial production was reshaping food, and he saw how chocolate, with its comforting flavor and growing reputation, was becoming a star. But Hershey didn't begin with caramels. He started with caramels. Chewy, sweet, slightly sticky caramels that became surprisingly popular. He built factories, hired workers, and expanded production. He learned the rhythm of business, the lessons of failure, and the delicate balance of supply and demand. He watched competitors rise and fall. And through all of this, he discovered one essential truth. People wanted sweetness, comfort, and convenience. Yet even as he succeeded, something kept tugging at him. Chocolate. He tasted it, studied it, experimented with it. He realized it had far more potential than caramels ever could. It was smoother, sturdier, more versatile. It could be molded into bars, wrapped, shipped, and stored with far fewer issues. And the world was hungry for it. Hungry in a literal sense, yes, but also metaphorically. Chocolate was becoming a symbol of modern indulgence. So Hershey began traveling. He visited the great chocolate operations of Europe, observing how cocoa was processed and transformed. He saw technologies he'd never encountered before. Machines that crushed cocoa beans, presses that separated cocoa butter from solids, and mixing equipment that blended sweetness into smoothness. And somewhere in the midst of all this whirring machinery and rich aroma, he realized this could be his future. But what Hershey didn't fully realize yet was the chocolate's invigorating reputation, as polite society called it, wasn't just from the cocoa itself. These European factories, like many operations of the time, were following old recipes shaped by decades of scientific enthusiasm and herbal experimentation. Many of these formulas incorporated botanical extracts believed to enhance vitality. Nobody whispered about it. Nobody panicked. It was simply a normal part of the industry. When Hershey returned to America and began experimenting in his own factories, he brought back not just techniques, but influences, ideas about how chocolate should taste, feel, and perhaps quietly energize. His earliest batches weren't the same as the Hershey bars of today. They were richer, earthier, and carried a faint memory of the old European formulas. But that's a story we'll wander into more deeply in the next chapters. For now, picture the world as Hershey saw it, full of opportunity, brimming with flavor, and buzzing, metaphorically of course, with the excitement of innovation. Chocolate wasn't just a treat, it was a symbol of progress, a sign that the modern era, for all its soot and confusion, could produce something undeniably delightful. No one at the time questioned why chocolate felt so uplifting. They didn't need to. Life was fast, exhausting, and unpredictable. If a simple square of dark brown sweetness made the day feel easier, that was enough. People didn't need explanations, they needed comfort. And so, as Hershey prepared to shift from caramels to chocolate, he wasn't stepping into a simple recipe. He was stepping into a complex world of tradition, science, misunderstanding, and optimism. A world where the boundaries between medicine, food, and indulgence were soft and blurry. A world where anything that could make life feel a little lighter was welcomed with open arms. This was the stage on which Hershey would eventually create his empire, a world humming with invention, fueled by hope, and sprinkled with just enough scientific confusion to make the story charmingly bizarre in hindsight. And as we move onward, we'll follow him into that world, slowly, calmly, step by step, just like a quiet evening walk through history.
Milton Hershey didn't arrive in the world with a silver spoon, a trust fund, or even a plan that made much sense on paper. What he did have was a calm, stubborn determination, an almost serene refusal to quit, even when every business he touched seemed determined to collapse in dramatic fashion. His early life unfolded like a quiet series of almosts, almost successful, almost stable, almost profitable. He tried printing. That didn't work. He tried candy making in different towns. Those didn't work either. Each failure was like a soft nudge from the universe saying, "Not yet, Milton. Try again, but slightly differently this time." And he did, over and over. There was something about him that simply didn't let go. Maybe it was optimism, or maybe it was pure momentum. Once he started moving, he didn't know how to stop. But in one of those small, strangely poetic turns of fate, he eventually found himself working with caramel. Not glamorous, not exciting, but dependable. And caramel rewarded him. It stuck to everything, including the walls, the floors, and probably his patience. But it also stuck to people's taste buds. His caramel company, after all the failures he had endured, finally worked. Success, though, has a way of quietly whispering new possibilities. And for Hershey, chocolate wasn't just a possibility, it was a calling. It drifted around him like a scent he couldn't ignore, warm, rich, promising something more. Even while his caramel business thrived, he found himself lingering on thoughts of cocoa beans, grinding mills, and those glossy brown mixtures he'd seen in Europe. Chocolate had captivated him long before he ever made a bar. It was as if something inside him knew that his future wasn't caramel-coated at all, it was chocolate-covered. So, while his workers wrapped caramels and stacked crates, Hershey watched. He watched the market. He watched the world change. He watched how people lit up when they talked about chocolate, even though it was still considered something exotic, expensive, and slightly mysterious. Hershey was fascinated by that reaction. He understood something essential. People didn't just love chocolate, they trusted it. It made them feel good in a cozy, reassuring way. And this is where the story begins brushing up against the more peculiar habits of the era, because the chocolate that Hershey fell in love with wasn't just chocolate. European chocolate makers had inherited a long history of herbal experimentation. Many early chocolate recipes had been influenced by old traditions, traditional medicines, old-world tonics, and the belief that certain natural extracts were good for stamina or clarity. Not in scandalous amounts, not in alarming ways, but enough that people often said chocolate made them feel unusually alert. It was a soft, subtle kind of energy, the kind that made long workdays feel a little smoother. When Hershey traveled abroad to study chocolate making, he absorbed everything: machinery designs, processing techniques, ingredient lists. He took meticulous notes and asked careful questions. But he wasn't just copying Europeans, he was analyzing them. He wanted to understand why their chocolate tasted so different, why it carried a certain liveliness on the palate, and why it seemed to have an uplifting effect on people. And so, when Hershey returned to America, he came back carrying more than suitcases. He carried ideas, ideas shaped by an era that didn't fully separate nutrition, comfort, and medicinal benefits. In his early experiments, the chocolate that Hershey produced tasted richer, denser, and somehow more old-world than the smooth, sweet bars we would recognize today. The formulas weren't identical to anything he'd tasted in Europe, but they shared a certain character, a robust, slightly lively character that reflected the culinary traditions of the time. In his small factory, Hershey and his workers began experimenting with cocoa in ways the American candy industry hadn't seen before. Cocoa beans were roasted, cracked, ground, pressed, and blended. Sugar was added, milk was added. The cocoa butter content was adjusted and readjusted, and occasionally certain plant-based flavorings common in European recipes made their appearance in the mixing rooms. Nothing alarming, nothing dramatic, just the kind of ingredients that early chocolate makers considered part of the craft. The people who tasted these early batches noticed immediately that Hershey's chocolate had something special. It wasn't just sweet, it had character. It had presence. It left an impression deeper than the brief flash of sugar on the tongue. It made people feel very slightly more awake, very slightly more cheerful, and very slightly more inclined to buy another piece. And in the industrial world of the late 1800s, where workers woke before sunrise and went to bed long before dark, a treat that offered a gentle lift was something people appreciated more than they questioned. Hershey, meanwhile, found himself increasingly obsessed. He tinkered with his recipes the way a watchmaker adjusts gears. He adjusted roasting times, grinding methods, and ingredient proportions. Sometimes he would stay up late testing small batches, tasting each variation with a thoughtful calmness. He wasn't just trying to make chocolate, he was trying to unlock something, some perfect combination of flavor, texture, and, let's call it vitality, the polite word of the age.
It wasn't long before he reached a decision that would change his life. He would sell his caramel company and focus entirely on chocolate. Almost everyone thought he was out of his mind. Caramel was profitable, beloved, and stable. Chocolate was volatile, expensive, and complex. But Hershey wasn't listening to caution. He had seen the future, and it was coded in cocoa. So he sold everything, the factories, the equipment, the distribution networks, and used the money to build something new, a chocolate factory of his own, a place where he could craft chocolate on a scale America had never seen before, a place where he could refine his techniques, expand production, and perfect his signature recipe. The early years of Hershey's chocolate production were filled with the kind of trial and error that would exhaust most people. Machines jammed, beans spoiled, milk curdled at inconvenient moments, workers complained, and Hershey kept going. He was guided by something deeper than ambition. It was almost a quiet certainty that he had placed himself on the right path, even if the path was winding, narrow, and occasionally covered in cocoa dust. And through all of this, Hershey was operating in a world that still believed deeply in the concept of invigorating foods. People talked openly about chocolate's energizing qualities. Articles praised its ability to lift moods and restore strength. Even physicians recommended it for patients who needed a strengthening tonic. Chocolate bars of the era weren't just treats, they were marketed, in gentle terms, as something beneficial. This general cultural mindset influenced everyone, including Hershey. When he crafted his early chocolate bars, he leaned heavily into the European traditions he had studied. He favored robust cocoa blends. He preserved certain flavor notes that felt rich and full. And like many chocolate makers of the time, he didn't shy away from the small botanical accents that had long been associated with premium chocolate. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't secretive, it was simply the culinary standard of the age. The results were chocolate bars that tasted noticeably different from the modern versions, heavier, deeper, more aromatic, and, in the opinion of many consumers, strangely uplifting. They didn't question it, they simply enjoyed it. The bars sold quickly, and word spread. Hershey's chocolate was comforting, satisfying, and just lively enough to feel special. The more people praised it, the more Hershey was convinced he had chosen correctly. The chocolate business wasn't just profitable, it was transformative. If caramel had been a foundation, chocolate was a doorway, one that led him into a future none of his early failures could have predicted. But even as Hershey's confidence grew, the world around him was starting to shift. Scientific understanding was improving. Researchers were beginning to study the effects of various natural extracts more closely. Governments were slowly waking up to the idea of food safety regulations. Newspapers that once advertised invigorating tonics began publishing articles about proper labeling. The energetic optimism of the 19th century was gently giving way to a more cautious early 20th century. And Hershey, with his booming chocolate empire, was about to feel the effects of that shift. His chocolate, beloved as it was part of an older tradition, one that the modern era was beginning to examine with new clarity. But for now, in this moment of the story, Hershey was thriving. His factories were expanding, his workers were busy, his chocolate was winning hearts across the country. And although the winds of change were approaching, they had not yet arrived. Soon enough, Hershey would face a new era, one that would question old practices and reshape the chocolate industry forever. But his resilience, his quiet determination, and his belief in chocolate would carry him through. By the time the new century arrived, Milton Hershey's world had expanded far beyond anything he had once imagined. His chocolate factory hummed with steady purpose, his workers had fallen into a confident rhythm, and the American public had begun forming a quiet attachment to his creations. Hershey's chocolate wasn't just a treat anymore. It was a small, comforting presence in people's daily lives, something they could rely on, a simple pleasure that felt stable in a world that was rapidly changing in every other direction. And to appreciate how meaningful that was, you have to picture the early 1900s not as a sepia-toned postcard, but as a noisy, bustling moment in history where modern life was still learning how to walk without tripping. Cities were growing so fast that nobody could build streets quickly enough.
Factories puffed steam into the sky from dawn until long past dusk. Telephones were buzzing, electric lights were blinking, and newspapers were packed with breathless stories about new inventions that promised to improve everything from household chores to personal health. This was the era when enthusiasm still outran caution. If someone invented a machine that looked impressive, people trusted it instantly. If a product claimed to make you feel stronger or sharper, nobody asked too many questions. After all, it wasn't as though there was a long list of official rules yet. Life was booming forward, and everyone was just trying to keep up. Chocolate fit perfectly into this energetic world. It was sweet, steady, reliable, and, according to the common wisdom of the time, a good source of restorative nourishment. Those were the exact words used in one magazine article, as if chocolate was sort of a warm, edible hug. And in a way, that wasn't wrong. It made people feel better. It made work breaks more pleasant. It made the evenings a touch softer. No wonder the public loved it. But, as often happens in history, the moment something becomes wildly popular, people begin studying it more closely. Not in a suspicious way, more like a curious friend leaning in to ask, "So, what exactly is your secret?" In the early 1900s, the field of food science was coming into its own. Laboratories were cleaner. Instruments were more precise. Researchers were examining ingredients not through excitement or hearsay, but through careful measurement and methodical experiments.
Suddenly, the era of just trust the label was ending. And right in the center of that shift was cocoa. Chocolate manufacturers had never been secretive. Their recipes were inspired by long European traditions. Their methods had roots in older practices passed down from generation to generation. But as scientists began analyzing food more closely, they started noticing details that previous eras hadn't paid much attention to. Things like percentages, concentrations, and chemical profiles. Things that felt very modern, very precise, and completely unfamiliar to companies that had been operating on instinct, experience, and tradition. Meanwhile, Hershey was expanding again. His chocolate company had grown so quickly that it practically demanded its own ecosystem, and Hershey, never someone to think small, decided to build one. He imagined a town built around his factory, where workers could live peacefully, raise families, and avoid the noise and chaos of big cities. A place where everything felt calm, stable, and orderly. And somehow he pulled it off. He built a town that carried his name, a place with tree-lined streets, neat homes, a trolley system, schools, and community halls. The whole thing seemed almost too peaceful to be real. Visitors described it as charming. Workers described it as comfortable. Children described it as magical because it smelled faintly of cocoa nearly every day of the year. Hershey, in his quiet and steady way, had created something remarkable. His chocolate business was thriving. His employees were happier than most factory workers in America. His town was becoming a model of modern planning, and his chocolate bars were reaching further and further across the country. But while Hershey was building this dreamlike world of sweetness and stability, the broader food industry was experiencing growing pains. People were starting to ask questions, curious ones at first, harmless ones, but questions nonetheless. What exactly makes certain foods invigorating? Are all ingredients being used in the safest possible way? Should there be clearer rules about what goes into products? These inquiries weren't directed at chocolate specifically. The entire food landscape was being reevaluated. Everything from canned goods to breakfast cereals was under scrutiny. If a product had been praised for giving people extra pep, researchers wanted to understand why. It was all very mild, very academic, very calm, but it signaled a turning point. Chocolate manufacturers, including Hershey, began noticing these shifts. They watched new scientific articles appear in journals. They watched lawmakers discuss early drafts of food safety legislation. They watched as consumers began to appreciate transparency more than mystery. The world was slowly moving away from the enthusiastic experimentation of the 19th century and toward a more careful, measured approach. Still, none of this created worry. Hershey's business was solid. His factories were clean and efficient. His reputation was strong.
If anything, he saw the new scientific clarity as helpful. After all, Hershey valued consistency. He believed that if you made something for the public, it should be as safe and stable as possible. But in order to make chocolate at an industrial scale, the company still relied on older recipe traditions shaped by European formulas, which themselves were shaped by centuries of herbal and botanical influence. These formulas produced chocolate that was robust, earthy, aromatic, and, according to the common language of the time, naturally uplifting. Consumers loved it. They trusted that feeling. It was familiar, comforting, just part of the chocolate experience. Yet as science evolved, researchers began distinguishing between the natural stimulating properties of cocoa beans and the additional plant-derived flavorings or enhancements that had developed through earlier traditions. Again, nothing scandalous, nothing unsafe, just ingredients that belonged to an older version of chocolate crafting, ingredients rooted in an era when food and mild medicinal benefits overlapped far more than they do today. Hershey, attentive as always, recognized that the industry was heading toward a new chapter, a chapter where formulas would be simplified, clarified, and standardized, a chapter where chocolate would be defined not by loose tradition, but by precise chemistry, a chapter where companies would gradually step away from Europa's old botanical flavor influences and toward a purer, milder, more uniform form of chocolate. But the transition wasn't abrupt, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve secrets or scandals. It unfolded slowly, almost peacefully, like a river gently carving a new path. Chocolate makers, including Hershey, simply began adjusting their recipes. They refined their bean selection processes. They changed how they balanced cocoa butter and solids. They modernized their ingredients lists, removing older botanical accents in favor of a cleaner, simpler, more universal flavor profile. And the public, interestingly, barely noticed. They were too focused on the taste, the texture, the comfort. Hershey's chocolate remained beloved. People cared more about the familiar crinkle of the wrapper and the sweetness melting on their tongues than they did about shifting recipe trends.
As Hershey continued refining his chocolate, his town continued to grow. More families moved in, schools expanded, shops opened, parks were built. The scent of chocolate remained a constant, drifting softly through the air as factories operated day and night. It gave the town a dreamy, cozy feeling, as if the entire community existed inside a slightly warm chocolate wrapper. In this peaceful setting, Hershey made decisions that shaped the future of his company. He invested in better machinery, more efficient processes, and higher quality ingredients. He introduced stronger safety measures, not because the law demanded it, but because he believed food should be something people trusted unconditionally. And gradually, his recipe evolved into the sweeter, milder flavor that would become synonymous with the Hershey brand. What people didn't realize at the time was that they were witnessing a gentle historical shift, the moment when chocolate moved from its old European medicinal traditions into its modern identity as a pure treat. No energizing embellishments, no herbal whispers from past centuries, just chocolate as chocolate. But that shift didn't happen overnight, and the world around Hershey was about to undergo even larger changes that would accelerate the move towards standardized, regulated, modern food production. And in the next chapter, we'll drift gently into that transformation, the rise of new laws, new scientific findings, and the quiet disappearance of the old world chocolate era that had influenced Hershey's earliest creations. The early 20th century had a certain charm, especially if you enjoy watching society try to act confident while it learns everything the hard way. People were beginning to notice that the world was becoming busier, faster, louder. Cities grew taller, factories grew larger, and workers grew more tired. Yet, in the background of all this progress, there was still that quiet belief that a little treat could fix anything. A candy bar wasn't just a candy bar, it was a tiny spark of hope in the middle of a long day. And Hershey's wanted to be right at the center of those small daily moments, offering something that felt comforting, energizing, and familiar. But by the time the 1900s really started stretching their legs, the scientific community began poking around with new tools, better microscopes, and increasingly suspicious eyebrows.
Their quiet investigations, carried out in laboratories that probably smelled like ink and disinfectant, soon revealed that the world was filled with substances people didn't fully understand. And when experts examined the energizing ingredients found in certain drinks, tonics, and yes, the cocoa imports used by chocolatier companies, they began to realize something important. Not everything that made you feel lively was necessarily meant to be in your daily snack. Still, this was a time when most households trusted advertisements more than warning labels. So while scientists pondered their findings, the average person happily bought the story that chocolate was practically nutritious. It was good for the nerves, good for the brain, good for the spirit. It soothed sadness and brightened the mood, or at least that's what the marketing liked to suggest. Add in a little extra lift from exotic ingredients, and you had something that people believed could help them power through the day like a cheerful steam engine. Inside the Hershey factories, the atmosphere was a careful balance of order and noise. Workers moved along production lines with practiced rhythm. Machines thumped and whirred, filling the air with the warm scent of cocoa and sugar. The process had been perfected with almost scientific precision. Every bar had to taste the same, feel the same, melt the same. Hershey knew consistency was key. People needed to know that whatever life threw at them, the long shifts, the changing world, the quiet worries, they could unwrap a little rectangle of comfort and trust it would meet them like an old friend. And part of that comforting effect came from the cocoa beans themselves, which had been traveling long journeys across oceans and continents. These beans carried their own natural stimulant compounds, the kind that gave chocolate its reputation for being a pleasant pick-me-up. In those early decades, however, cocoa shipments sometimes included more than just caffeine and theobromine. Depending on the region, the processing, and the supplier, some batches came with traces of other plant-derived compounds too, remnants from the leaves and pods they were often transported alongside. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous, just enough that a consumer might say, "Wow, this chocolate really wakes me up," without thinking too much about it. Meanwhile, the broader food industry was undergoing a nervous awakening. Governments had begun paying attention to what went into everyday products. New laws, committees, and public health researchers appeared almost overnight, squinting at labels that had never been meant for scrutiny. The Pure Food and Drug Act had already forced companies to start being more transparent, and each year brought new guidelines. If an ingredient couldn't be clearly defined, explained, or scientifically justified, it had to go.
Chocolate companies felt this shift immediately. Many had built their reputations on exotic-sounding blends or energizing formulas, but Hershey, with its more modest, straightforward recipes, adapted smoothly. The company quietly updated supply chains, insisted on cleaner sourcing, and gradually ensured that all cocoa imports met the new standards. What customers loved, its flavor, its texture, its comforting personality, stayed exactly the same. The only real difference was that certain naturally occurring stimulants became more controlled, monitored, and filtered out, leaving behind a chocolate bar that was gentler, simpler, and more suitable for a world that was slowly learning to read fine print. By this point, consumers had also changed. They were beginning to prefer predictability. The old fascination with invigorating snacks had softened, replaced by a desire for steadiness. A treat didn't need to wake you up anymore. It needed to help you relax, reward yourself, or just add a little warmth to a dull moment. When people opened a Hershey bar, they weren't seeking an energetic jolt. They wanted sweetness, nostalgia, maybe even a little bit of peace. So Hershey adapted, like a polite giant moving through a transforming world. The company refined its recipes, strengthened its quality controls, and positioned itself as the trustworthy choice. And as the decades passed, the memory of those earlier, livelier chocolate days faded quietly into the background. Most people never knew how different the ingredients once were. They only knew that Hershey's tasted like childhood, comfort, and normalcy. A bar you could enjoy on a lazy afternoon without feeling like the universe suddenly switched to fast forward.
Looking back, it's almost soothing to consider how something as small as a chocolate bar could drift through so many eras, shaped by global trade, scientific curiosity, and shifting human habits. The Hershey bar didn't shout for attention, it simply changed gently with the times, settling into the role it still holds today. Familiar, mellow, dependable. A little square of calm in a world that never seems to stop moving. By the time the 1910s drifted into the 1920s, the world felt like it had collectively taken a very deep breath and held it for a bit too long. Everything was changing, faster than most people were comfortable admitting, and the cheerful optimism of the previous decades had been nudged aside by a more cautious curiosity. Factories were bigger, streets were louder, cities felt busier, as though someone had slowly turned up the volume and forgotten to turn it back down. Yet in the middle of all this, chocolate bars remained one of the few constants. They were affordable, they tasted good, and they had that wonderful ability to make an ordinary moment feel a little more manageable. Hershey's, by this point, had fully settled into its role as the dependable friend in the candy aisle. People didn't question what went into a chocolate bar. Not really. They trusted that it was simple, sweet, and made from ingredients they recognized, even if they couldn't exactly list them out in order. And Hershey liked to keep things that way, predictable, steady, and unthreatening. Still, the world around them was shifting, and with every shift came a new wave of regulations, studies, and public discussions about the mysterious contents of everyday foods. It wasn't that people distrusted chocolate, far from it. They adored it. But curiosity was creeping into conversations in ways they hadn't before. Newspapers published articles with headlines like, "What's really in your pantry?" and "The Hidden Lives of Everyday Ingredients." Scientists, those quiet, meticulous observers, kept raising their hands to announce new discoveries about compounds in foods, medicines, and drinks. And gradually, people began to ask questions they'd never thought to ask. Where exactly did cocoa beans come from? How were they transported? What else traveled with them? What happened between the tropical farm and the neatly wrapped bar on the grocery shelf? Suddenly, supply chains were no longer invisible. They had become stories. Stories with ships, ports, merchants, warehouses, and a surprising number of steps that nobody had previously given much thought. Hershey's supply chain, like most of its competitors, spanned oceans. Cocoa beans were grown on plantations far from American borders. They were harvested, bagged, shipped, unloaded, roasted, ground, mixed, refined, and molded before ever becoming the chocolate that melted on the tongue. The more people learned about global trade, the more they realized how many little details could influence flavor, texture, and yes, the chemical makeup of the final product. Cocoa beans sometimes shared space with crates of other plants during transport. Leaves, dust, and small traces of other botanical materials occasionally mingled with the beans. Nothing dramatic, nothing harmful, but enough that early batches could sometimes carry compounds that added a surprising amount of pep to the overall experience. In the more relaxed decades of the late 1800s, nobody questioned those subtle effects. If a chocolate bar made you feel pleasantly awake, people chalked it up to good cocoa and good craftsmanship. But by the 1920s, society had become more attentive. People wanted purity, clarity, and honesty from the foods they bought. They weren't interested in mysterious boosts of energy. After a world war and a changing industrial landscape, they craved stability more than excitement. And so, Hershey's, ever aware of public sentiment, leaned into refinement. Not in a flashy way, not in a way that sought attention. Instead, the company quietly improved its sourcing standards, deepened its relationships with consistent suppliers, and implemented tighter quality controls. This shift wasn't about removing anything dramatic. It was about precision, knowing exactly what went in, what stayed out, and how each step affected the final product.
Workers in the factory could feel the change, though it wasn't something they discussed. The air smelled the same. The machines performed their usual mechanical humming, but there was a heightened sense of order in how everything was done. New guidelines arrived. Samples were tested more often.
Cocoa shipments were inspected with greater care. The company was beginning to build the modern food production model, where every stage needed to be documented, controlled, and predictable. This also marked the era in which chocolate companies began investing more heavily in research. Not dramatic research, not the kind involving bubbling beakers and explosions, but steady, methodical studies of ingredients. Scientists employed by Hershey examined factors such as roasting temperatures, refining times, fat ratios, crystallization patterns, and the chemistry of cocoa solids. They began to understand chocolate not just as a food, but as a delicate, complex suspension of compounds that behaved very differently depending on how they were treated. And with better understanding came better chocolate. The flavor grew smoother, the texture became silkier, the shelf life improved. The bars looked more uniform, more polished. Consumers didn't need to know the specifics, they only noticed that their favorite treat felt even more satisfying, even more consistent. Hershey embraced this subtle evolution, letting the chocolate speak for itself. Meanwhile, across the country, discussions about food safety continued to rise. Everything from flour to canned goods to beverages was being examined. Public trust was being rebuilt one regulation at a time. By the mid-1920s, the era of vague labels and mystery ingredients had largely faded. Consumers now expected clarity, and companies were expected to provide it. This created an environment where chocolate companies, including Hershey, had to become more transparent, more careful, and more methodical with their formulations. This didn't disrupt the comforting nature of the Hershey bar. If anything, it reinforced it. People liked knowing their chocolate was coming from a company that consistently stayed ahead of the rules rather than scrambling behind them. So even as other industries faced scandals or public backlash over questionable ingredients, Hershey sailed quietly along, making adjustments well before they became mandatory. By now, the chocolate bar had fully moved into the role it still enjoys today, a simple pleasure. It didn't claim to cure fatigue or sharpen the mind or fuel industriousness. It didn't promise any strange or magical benefits. If anything, its greatest quality was that it asked nothing from you. You didn't need to interpret it, analyze it, or wonder about its effects. You just opened it, took a bite, and let the flavor do the rest. But beneath that simplicity was a remarkable amount of attention, layers of refinement that kept the chocolate from reflecting the chaotic, fast-changing world around it. Hershey had built a reputation for reliability, and reliability comes from being quietly meticulous. The chapter of history in which chocolate carried more natural stimulants had been politely closed. The world had changed, regulations had settled, consumers had become more cautious, and companies like Hershey had adapted so smoothly that most people never even noticed. This transition was not marked by announcements or headlines. It was simply a gentle shift in how ingredients were sourced and how factories operated. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s and 1940s, Hershey's refined processes became the standard. Food scientists were now embedded in production. Cocoa beans were handled with greater care. The company had mastered the art of turning a global crop into a familiar treat with predictable flavor and texture. And that subtle consistency, barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention, became part of the comfort people felt when they picked up a Hershey bar. Life might have been unpredictable, but chocolate was not. Decades of refinement had ensured that what you tasted on a cold winter night would be the same as what someone else enjoyed on a warm summer afternoon. There was something almost soothing in that. Looking back, it's almost surreal how a chocolate bar could move through so many phases of history: industrial revolutions, scientific discoveries, regulatory shifts, and still maintain the same gentle personality. It didn't hurry the world along or try to keep pace with every trend. It simply stayed steady, letting everything else swirl around it. And as people continued to unwrap that little rectangle of sweetness, they never really knew how much work went into making it so pleasantly uneventful.
That was the real achievement. Transforming a global supply chain, shifting scientific understanding, and evolving production methods, all without changing the flavor that people loved.
As the 1930s settled over the world like a heavy gray quilt, people found themselves navigating a landscape that felt quieter in some places and far more uncertain in others. Money was tight, jobs were shifting, and entire communities were reshaping themselves around the strange rhythm of economic hardship. Yet even in that uneasy decade, one thing remained remarkably steady: the simple reassurance of a chocolate bar. It was affordable, it was familiar, and it had that magical ability to give people a momentary sense of normalcy when the world wasn't offering much of it. For Hershey, these years weren't about flash or reinvention. They were about doing what they already did, just better, steadier, and with even more attention to detail. The company had no interest in drama. It didn't chase fads or promise miraculous benefits. Instead, it leaned deeper into reliability. Every bar had to be exactly what people expected, nothing more and nothing less. When life was unpredictable, predictability became a quiet luxury. Factories by now had become almost mechanical symphonies of order. Workers understood the rhythm of the machines like musicians in an orchestra. Roasters hissed gently. Mixers turned with a slow, reassuring hum. Tempering machines clicked and whirred with the steady confidence of devices that had been perfected over years. Cocoa beans, cleaner, more carefully sourced, more tightly regulated, arrived in the facility like dependable old travelers who knew exactly what they were there for. Chocolate making had shifted from a craft mixed with guesswork into something closer to a science. Not a cold science, but a comforting one, the sort with neat notebooks, careful measurements, and dedicated technicians who took pride in understanding how each variable shaped the final result. They studied things like particle size, moisture content, and the behavior of cocoa butter at different temperatures. They learned how to make chocolate stable enough to survive transport, but soft enough to melt pleasantly on the tongue. This process wasn't about eliminating charm, it was about refining it. Meanwhile, the world outside the factory walls was having its own lessons in regulation and responsibility. The public had become more aware of the importance of transparency. Labels grew more informative, standards grew stricter, and organizations overseeing food safety became far more assertive in making sure manufacturers followed the rules. Hershey adapted easily, partly because they had been inching toward these standards long before they were mandatory, and partly because their business model was built on being dependable, not daring. The days when a chocolate bar might carry unexpected botanical compounds were fading into the quiet corners of history, not because anything dangerous had been lurking in the past, but because the world had moved into a new phase of awareness. People now wanted certainty. They wanted foods that were exactly what they claimed to be. They wanted comfort that didn't come with surprises. In a way, this shift mirrored the changing emotional climate of the nation. People weren't craving energy or novelty. They were craving something gentle, something steady, a small treat that didn't try to fix anything or promise too much. Hershey's was perfect for that. Its formula had grown calmer, more intentionally simple, reflecting a world that needed less stimulation and more reassurance. During this time, the company also expanded its role beyond the average grocery shelf. As the United States inched toward involvement in global conflicts, Hershey became an unexpected player in military supply chains. The company was asked to produce chocolate bars for soldiers, bars that needed to withstand heat, travel long distances, and provide calories without melting into a puddle of goo the moment the weather got warm. These new responsibilities led Hershey's engineers and food scientists to dive even deeper into the chemistry of chocolate. They learned how different fats behaved under stress. They studied the melting points of cocoa butter with almost meditative focus. They experimented with ingredients that could help chocolate endure hotter climates without turning into a sticky mess.
These military rations were not the sweet, indulgent version found in candy aisles. They were sturdy, dense, practical, more like edible morale boosters than treats. But the work done to perfect them had ripple effects. It taught Hershey new ways to stabilize chocolate, it deepened their understanding of ingredients, and it reinforced the importance of absolute control over every stage of production. This obsession with precision had another effect. It made any sort of unexpected compound increasingly impossible. By the time Hershey reached the late 1930s and early 1940s, quality control was so thorough that even slight irregularities were caught and corrected before reaching consumers. Factories had evolved into environments where everything was measured, monitored, and recorded. Every ingredient had a purpose, every step had a reason. There was no longer room for the unintentional pep that had once been a casual side effect of global cocoa sourcing.
Yet, even as science took a firmer grip on the chocolate-making process, the emotional role of the Hershey bar stayed the same. It remained a comfort, a reward at the end of a long day, a little piece of sweetness that didn't demand attention or analysis. People didn't need to think about chemistry to enjoy it. They didn't need to know about supply chains or roasting temperatures. They just needed a quiet moment, a small escape, and a simple taste that reminded them of what was still good in the world. Throughout the war years, Hershey bars became small symbols of home. Soldiers carried them in pockets. Civilians tucked them into care packages. Children rationed them carefully, savoring each small square as if it were a treasure. The world was far from calm during those years, but chocolate somehow made it feel a little more human. Factories operated around the clock, sometimes with dimmed lights or modified schedules, yet the quality never wavered. The company's core identity, steadiness, became even more pronounced. Workers knew they were contributing something meaningful, even if it was just a small treat wrapped in paper. They took pride in perfection. They took pride in knowing that each bar was a little message of normalcy in a time when normalcy felt scarce. As peacetime returned, Hershey faced a new kind of world, one with televisions, supermarkets, and increasingly competitive branding. Other companies launched products with bold flavors and flashy packaging. Some promised bursts of energy, others promised exotic experiences. But Hershey didn't join the noise. Instead, it continued drifting along at its own gentle pace, almost like an old friend who refuses to change just because trends come and go. The chocolate bar's composition during these years was simple, deliberate, and remarkably consistent. The company had spent decades refining every step, and now those refinements had locked the product into an identity that was both timeless and familiar. The days of lively chocolate formulations were long gone, replaced by recipes that were mild, smooth, and comforting. And yet, the story of those earlier years, when ingredients traveled unpredictably and the science of food was still learning how to catch up, left its subtle mark on history. It became one of those odd little footnotes, something people might hear about decades later and raise an eyebrow at, not because it was shocking, but because it was such a perfect snapshot of an era when the world simply didn't know what it didn't know. By the 1950s, the Hershey bar had completed its evolution. It had moved from the energetic, mildly unpredictable treat of the early industrial age into the calm, soothing, utterly familiar chocolate bar people recognized instantly. It was dependable, it was nostalgic, it was safe, and most importantly, it carried none of the botanical surprises that once slipped quietly into chocolate during its long, complicated journey from field to factory. The modern era of chocolate had begun, smooth, regulated, well understood, and comfortingly unremarkable. Yet there was something almost cozy about how this transformation had happened. Slowly, steadily, without publicity or drama. One decade smoothed into the next, one improvement led quietly to another, and before anyone noticed, the Hershey bar had become the simple, gentle indulgence it still is. By the time the 1950s fully settled in, the Hershey chocolate bar had become more than just a treat. It was quietly woven into the fabric of daily life. Homes smelled of coffee and chocolate in the morning. Lunchboxes contained neatly wrapped squares for children who regarded them as small tokens of reassurance, little rewards for enduring long school days. Offices had them tucked into drawers for adults who needed a brief escape from typewriters, ledgers, and the monotonous hum of fluorescent lights. Hershey's chocolate had become a kind of cultural punctuation, a pause, a sigh, a comfort that required no explanation. And this subtle presence was no accident. It was the product of decades of refinement, adaptation, and meticulous attention to every small detail along the journey from tropical plantation to grocery shelf. At this point, Hershey himself was no longer the young man tirelessly tinkering with recipes, experimenting late into the night with cocoa beans and caramels. He had grown into the role of the quiet architect of a world he could see taking shape around him. A town, a factory, and an entire social ecosystem that revolved around chocolate. His decisions were deliberate, almost meditative, informed by decades of observation and hard-earned lessons. He understood the chocolate's power wasn't in exotic ingredients, mysterious stimulants, or extravagant marketing claims. Its true power lay in consistency. The ability to deliver the same small pleasure, time after time, to anyone who unwrapped a bar. Yet, even as chocolate became normalized and familiar, the world beyond the factory walls was moving in ways that demanded attention. New appliances, televisions, and refrigerators changed the way people consumed food. People expected more control, more hygiene, more predictability. Food safety, long a concern in the shadows of earlier industrial decades, had become a public demand. And the regulations surrounding every ingredient, every shipment, and every production line were tightening. Companies that failed to adapt would face scrutiny, ridicule, or worse. Hershey's, with its culture of meticulous precision, was unusually well prepared to navigate these waters.
One of the subtle but significant shifts during this time was the growing awareness of global sourcing. Cocoa beans still traveled thousands of miles, from tropical regions to Pennsylvania, but the process had become far more tightly regulated and scrutinized. Suppliers were selected with greater care. Shipments were inspected for consistency and purity. Traces of foreign plant matter that might once have been incidentally included were now systematically filtered out. Nothing dangerous, certainly, but these changes reflected an era in which both public expectations and scientific understanding were finally converging. Hershey's chocolate was now completely predictable. Its flavor, texture, and even the minor lift once associated with its foreign origins had been refined out of the equation. And yet, even stripped of these accidental enhancements, the chocolate retained its charm. The reason was deceptively simple. Hershey had mastered the art of producing pleasure without relying on surprises. A chocolate bar didn't need mysterious stimulants or exotic additives to succeed. Its texture, flavor, and consistent quality were enough. In an era when life could feel unpredictable and occasionally harsh, the simple reliability of a Hershey bar became a form of comfort. People didn't notice the science behind it, they simply appreciated the effect. A small rectangle of sweetness could soothe a moment of tension, offer a brief mental pause, and act as a companion for everything from a quiet evening at home to a long commute across town. This era also saw a cultural embedding of chocolate that further reinforced its gentle ubiquity. Advertising began to highlight simplicity, wholesome enjoyment, and family-friendly appeal. The language shifted subtly. Instead of invigorating, it became comforting. Instead of energizing, it became enjoyable. Marketing and public perception moved in sync, both reflecting a society increasingly focused on emotional security, nostalgia, and quiet pleasure. A Hershey bar was no longer a minor stimulant, it was an emblem of consistency in a rapidly evolving world.
At the same time, the industrial and scientific improvements achieved in previous decades continued to pay dividends. Chocolate makers, Hershey included, had perfected the balance between milk and cocoa solids, mastered the tempering process, and created machinery capable of producing uniform bars in massive quantities. Quality control was no longer a vague ambition, it was a system. Every batch could be traced, every ingredient measured, every variable recorded. This level of precision ensured that a chocolate bar bought in one part of the country tasted the same as a bar purchased thousands of miles away, a remarkable achievement in an era when transportation, storage, and climate could easily affect a product's consistency. The social implications of this consistency were subtle but profound. Families could rely on chocolate for predictable enjoyment. Soldiers during wartime had experienced Hershey bars as dependable morale boosters. Children came to expect them in lunchboxes. Even adults, wearied from the pressures of work, appreciated that the experience of a Hershey bar was unchanging, stable, and gently reassuring. In a world increasingly defined by unpredictability, these little blocks of chocolate were anchors of normalcy. Meanwhile, the industry as a whole was also learning lessons that would shape the modern conception of food. Other companies struggled to adapt to the emerging regulations. Some faced public scandals over ingredients or labeling errors. Others experimented with additives that promised more energy or exotic experiences, only to discover that consumers were no longer interested in unpredictable surprises. Hershey's, by contrast, had long focused on what could be controlled: sourcing, production, flavor, texture, and safety. This strategic conservatism, combined with decades of prior refinement, allowed the company to prosper when many competitors faltered. Interestingly, despite the careful standardization, chocolate retained a subtle sense of delight. There was artistry in the precise balance of sweetness, creaminess, and cocoa flavor. It wasn't flashy and it didn't demand attention, but it elicited satisfaction nonetheless. The fact that it had become consistent, reliable, and thoroughly understood only reinforced its charm. People could enjoy chocolate quietly, without concern or hesitation. It had become a companion rather than a curiosity, a small, edible ritual embedded into everyday life. Hershey's town continued to reflect these values. Homes were orderly, community spaces were clean and welcoming, and the scent of chocolate drifting from the factory added a kind of olfactory reassurance. Children played under the gentle hum of machinery, families gathered in small parks, and workers took pride in producing something that millions of people could rely upon. The town, like the chocolate itself, was steady and comforting, a microcosm of predictability amid a world that had grown increasingly complex. Even as television and mass media began to dominate daily life, Hershey's chocolate maintained its identity. It didn't compete with flashy claims or dramatic marketing gimmicks. It quietly offered a familiar experience, one that generations had come to trust. And in doing so, it cemented its role not just as a sweet treat, but as a kind of cultural touchstone, a simple, reliable pleasure in an era of rapid technological and social change.
The decades following the Second World War would continue this trajectory. Chocolate bars became household staples, integrated into daily routines, gifts, holidays, and celebrations. Hershey's had, through careful stewardship, transformed a product with roots in an unpredictable, lightly stimulative past into a symbol of calm, reliability, and nostalgic pleasure. The accidental enhancements of early cocoa shipments had vanished, the era of invigorating chocolate had quietly ended, and what remained was a product designed for enjoyment rather than effect, a bar you could trust, a bar that never demanded more from you than the simple act of unwrapping it. And yet, when we look back at the entire story, there is something quietly fascinating about how Hershey's achieved this transformation. It was not through flamboyance, scandal, or extreme invention. It was through patience, meticulous attention to detail, and a consistent commitment to quality. Over the decades, chocolate evolved from a slightly unpredictable, mildly stimulating treat into a soothing, familiar presence in everyday life. And that transformation, gentle though it was, laid the foundation for everything we now take for granted about the Hershey bar. Its taste, its texture, its reliability, and the comfort it continues to provide in a world that never stops moving. By the 1960s, the Hershey chocolate bar had become a quiet staple in American life, almost invisible in its reliability, yet deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness. It didn't shout, it didn't promise sudden energy or miraculous effects, and it didn't need to. Its presence was subtle but constant, the kind of quiet comfort that people hardly noticed until it was missing. Children unwrapped them in classrooms, office workers stashed them in drawers, parents tucked them into lunchboxes, and teenagers carried them in pockets while navigating the small dramas of adolescence. The chocolate bar had become a constant companion, a minor ritual, a comforting punctuation mark in the unfolding story of daily life. The company itself, meanwhile, had evolved in ways that mirrored this social embedding. Hershey's factories had become marvels of consistency and precision. Machines that once required constant human adjustment were now calibrated with scientific accuracy, humming along with a confidence that echoed through the buildings. Each batch of chocolate was monitored meticulously, from the moment cocoa beans arrived to the final wrapper being folded neatly over the finished bar. Quality control was no longer a goal, it was a culture. Every employee understood their role in maintaining it, and every step was documented, measured, and recorded. This system was invisible to consumers, but vital to the continued success of the brand. The world outside Hershey's operations had changed significantly as well. Globalization had introduced new supply chain complexities, yet also new standards. Cocoa sourcing had become more regulated, more transparent, and more scientifically informed. What had once been a minor, almost accidental aspect of chocolate production, the natural variability of beans, the incidental traces of other plant matter, the subtle stimulants lingering in European-inspired recipes, had been smoothed out through careful attention, oversight, and technology. By now, chocolate was almost entirely predictable. It was safe, consistent, and entirely enjoyable without requiring the consumer to think about what they were eating. Yet, while the product itself had become more uniform, the social context in which it existed added layers of meaning. A chocolate bar was not just a snack, it was a symbol of modern life's small pleasures. Families relied on it for moments of connection, comfort, and routine. Soldiers had once carried it as a morale booster. Workers enjoyed it as a brief reprieve, and children saw it as a small reward or a shared treat among friends. Its role was almost ritualistic, a predictable indulgence that could soften the edges of a world growing faster and noisier by the day. In the factory, this emphasis on consistency and stability extended beyond production. Hershey had become a pioneer in employee welfare, reflecting a philosophy that comfort and trust weren't just for the consumer, they were for the people who created the product as well. Workers were provided with stable employment, safe working conditions, and a sense of community that mirrored the careful planning of the town around the factory. In many ways, the town and the factory were reflections of each other, orderly, reliable, and designed to foster calm in a world increasingly defined by unpredictability. Scientific research continued to play a quiet but pivotal role during this period. Hershey employed food scientists who examined the minutiae of chocolate production, studying everything from tempering processes to the behavior of cocoa solids under different conditions. This research wasn't about creating novelty, it was about control, predictability, and reliability. Every improvement, every refinement made the chocolate more consistent, more resistant to variations in temperature, storage, and shipment, and more reliably enjoyable. It was an era of subtle perfection, where small, almost imperceptible adjustments ensured that every bite delivered exactly what the consumer expected. The cultural perception of chocolate had shifted dramatically. Gone were the days when it was associated with mild stimulation, unusual botanical additives, or exotic European recipes. Instead, chocolate had become synonymous with comfort, nostalgia, and predictability. Marketing campaigns emphasized these qualities.
The language used in advertising highlighted enjoyment, reassurance, and family values, rather than any sort of mysterious energy or vitality. Hershey's chocolate was no longer a curious stimulant, it was a dependable companion, quietly reinforcing routines and rituals that provided emotional stability in a world that sometimes felt chaotic.
The global supply chain had also been refined. Cocoa beans, once subject to the whims of weather, travel conditions, and storage practices, were now carefully sourced from trusted suppliers. Beans were inspected rigorously, stored under precise conditions, and processed using methods that minimized variability. The incidental compounds that had sometimes found their way into early chocolate bars were now eliminated through careful filtering and standardization. By the 1960s, Hershey's chocolate was as predictable chemically as it was culturally, a perfect marriage of science, precision, and social expectation. Even as other industries experimented with exotic flavors, additives, and bold claims, Hershey stayed the course. The company had learned a subtle truth. True innovation sometimes meant perfecting what already worked rather than chasing the flashy or the extreme. By focusing on stability, flavor, and consistency, Hershey ensured that their chocolate remained a trusted staple across multiple generations. Consumers didn't need novelty, they needed reliability, and Hershey delivered. Interestingly, the simplicity of the chocolate bar contributed to its enduring appeal. It didn't demand intellectual engagement, moral judgment, or careful planning. It asked nothing more than to be unwrapped, enjoyed, and remembered. Its power was in its predictability and its gentle, calming presence in moments of small personal ritual. A child savoring a lunchbox treat, a worker taking a mid-afternoon break, a couple sharing a quiet moment, they all found a subtle pleasure in the consistent texture, the gentle sweetness, and the soothing familiarity of the bar. In some ways, Hershey's chocolate had become a kind of cultural anchor. While the world outside Hershey's factories evolved rapidly, social norms shifted, technology accelerated, cities grew more complex, the chocolate bar remained a constant. It reminded people that even amidst change, certain small comforts could be relied upon. The taste, the texture, the slight warmth of melted chocolate on the tongue, all of it became a bridge between decades, connecting childhood experiences to adult nostalgia, connecting different generations to the same familiar ritual. The 1960s were also a time when food science increasingly intersected with public health. Nutritional standards were being discussed more rigorously, and consumers began to take a more analytical approach to what they ate. Yet, Hershey's chocolate, thanks to decades of careful refinement, was already well positioned to meet these expectations. Ingredients were clear, production methods were transparent, and the product itself had been standardized to such a degree that it no longer contained the unpredictable elements that might have been present in earlier eras. It was not only delicious, it was safe, consistent, and fully aligned with the emerging norms of public health. And while the world outside Hershey's factories shifted, expanded, and sometimes grew chaotic, the town itself continued to reflect the same values that Milton Hershey had envisioned decades earlier: community, stability, and gentle reassurance. Workers' families lived in neat, orderly homes, streets were maintained with care, and the subtle, comforting scent of chocolate drifting through the air became part of the town's identity. It was a quiet, almost meditative environment, a deliberate counterbalance to the ever-increasing pace of life beyond the factory gates. By now, Hershey's chocolate had firmly cemented itself as a ritual of reliability. No longer was it experimental, mildly stimulating, or subtly unpredictable. It had transitioned fully into a treat that was culturally, chemically, and emotionally consistent. Each bar represented decades of incremental improvements, careful observation, and meticulous attention to detail,
a product shaped by history yet designed for timeless enjoyment. And as consumers unwrapped their chocolate, whether in a bustling city apartment, a quiet suburban home, or a lunchroom far from the factory, they experienced more than just flavor. They experienced a small, unspoken promise that in a world filled with uncertainty, here was something gentle, familiar, and steadfast. A bar that wouldn't change its mind, a bar that wouldn't surprise or disappoint. A bar that was, in its quiet way, a tiny anchor amid the shifting tides of everyday life. As the 1970s rolled in, the world seemed to move faster, brighter, louder, and often more complicated than ever before. New technologies, music, media, and social movements surged forward, reshaping the rhythms of everyday life. Yet, amidst all the change, the Hershey chocolate bar remained steadfast. It did not compete with the novelty of the era, nor did it claim to transform anyone's life. Instead, it performed the role it had been perfecting for decades, offering a small, reliable pleasure, a moment of calm, a brief escape, a gentle comfort wrapped in a familiar paper sleeve. People had come to rely on it, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was consistent. The decades of meticulous attention to production now bore their full fruit. Hershey's chocolate was not only delicious, but predictable in every measurable way. Quality control systems had become more advanced, integrating chemical analysis, precise temperature control, and careful monitoring of every stage of production. Machines ran like clockwork, and workers, familiar with the rhythms of these devices, moved with a practiced calm. Each chocolate bar was nearly identical to the last, a seemingly simple fact, but one that carried a subtle emotional significance for consumers. Consistency, it turned out, was a kind of reassurance. In the broader cultural context, chocolate continued to occupy a special role. It was both a personal indulgence and a shared ritual. Lunchboxes, desks, homes, and schoolyards all contained these little blocks of sweetness, quietly connecting people across the country. Children delighted in their simple taste, adults found a small moment of relief in their predictability, and families used them to mark celebrations, holidays, and quiet personal victories. Hershey had become more than a product. It had become a ritualized pause, a tiny anchor in a world that seemed to change daily. Despite this calm presence, the chocolate industry continued to evolve. Advances in food science, marketing, and packaging created new expectations. Consumers began to care not just about taste, but about nutrition, sourcing, and ingredient transparency. Global supply chains had become increasingly complex, and social awareness of food origins was rising. Yet Hershey's had anticipated much of this evolution decades earlier. By the 1970s, sourcing practices were precise, ingredients were rigorously tested, and the company's reputation for reliability remained intact. Whereas other brands scrambled to adapt, Hershey's had quietly built a system that harmonized perfectly with the new demands. The chocolate itself, though unchanged in its essential taste, reflected decades of subtle refinement. Cocoa beans were now carefully graded for consistency, and any minor variations that might have once influenced flavor were eliminated. The texture had been perfected through precise control of particle size and cocoa butter content. Tempering machines ensured the right gloss, the right snap, and the right melt. Each bite was a small triumph of science and craftsmanship, achieved without the consumer ever realizing the complexity behind it. What seemed effortless was actually the result of decades of careful observation, experimentation, and incremental improvement. At the same time, Hershey's remained culturally adaptive, though in quiet ways. Advertising reinforced comfort, nostalgia, and familiarity rather than novelty. The messaging emphasized family, home, and emotional connection, reflecting a society that sought stability and reassurance amidst rapid social change. The product itself needed no exaggeration. Its consistency was enough to speak for it. In a time of technological acceleration and social upheaval, predictability became a form of subtle luxury. Chocolate was no longer merely edible,
It was emotional currency, a piece of everyday calm. Even within the company, there was a growing awareness of chocolate's role in the broader world. Hershey's factories were no longer just sites of production. They were carefully maintained ecosystems, integrating safety, employee welfare, and process control. Workers took pride in their part of the chain, knowing that each bar was more than just a sweet treat. It was a piece of comfort for someone, somewhere, navigating the unpredictability of life. This quiet sense of purpose reinforced the company's culture of meticulous care and attention, ensuring that quality remained unwavering as even global conditions shifted. Meanwhile, scientific understanding of food continued to progress. Nutritional studies, chemical analyses, and regulatory oversight were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Any ingredients with potential variability or unpredictability were scrutinized or removed. The chocolate bars that Americans unwrapped in the 1970s bore little resemblance to their unpredictable predecessors of the early 1900s. The traces of stimulants or incidental botanical compounds had been thoroughly eliminated. What remained was a product designed for calm, enjoyment, and reassurance. A chocolate bar that required no explanation, no hesitation, no careful thought. Just a familiar taste, a familiar texture, and a reliable moment of comfort. The consistency and dependability of Hershey's chocolate also played a subtle social role. In schools, it was a shared delight among friends. In workplaces, a brief reprieve from monotony. In homes, a small unspoken reward or a comforting ritual. Unlike many products of the time that sought attention through bold claims or flashy innovations, Hershey's chocolate achieved its cultural significance by maintaining a quiet, steadfast presence. It reminded people that not all change was necessary or desirable, that some pleasures were best left unaltered and predictable. The decade also saw the rise of new marketing channels and mass media exposure, but Hershey continued to rely on subtle messaging. Television ads, print campaigns, and product placements reinforced emotional stability, family bonding, and everyday enjoyment rather than energy, excitement, or novelty. The chocolate bar's calm, reassuring character was not diminished by the flashier trends of pop culture. In fact, it was enhanced. In a world of overstimulation, the unassuming Hershey bar became an oasis of quiet familiarity, a product whose strength lay in its simplicity.
Global trade and supply chain precision, too, had matured significantly. Cocoa beans were sourced from well-vetted farms and processed under strict oversight. Every stage, from shipping to roasting, refining, and molding, was carefully controlled. The once accidental variability that had occasionally influenced early chocolate formulations was gone. Hershey's chocolate of the 1970s was entirely predictable, yet its consistency carried a subtle emotional weight. Consumers could rely on the same comforting taste wherever they were, in a world that increasingly lacked stability. The product's evolution was almost imperceptible to the everyday consumer, yet its cultural and emotional significance deepened. Chocolate had transformed from an intriguing, mildly stimulating confection of the early 1900s into a familiar, emotionally anchoring treat by the 1970s. It had become a small but essential element in the routines, celebrations, and quiet moments of millions of people's lives. The accidental stimulants, the exotic flavorings, and the minor unpredictabilities of earlier eras had been replaced with precision, reliability, and subtle perfection. By the close of the decade, Hershey's chocolate had achieved something remarkable. It had become a product fully integrated into both culture and routine, trusted for consistency, loved for comfort, and respected for its quality. It remained unassuming, modest, and remarkably steady, a gentle anchor in a world moving ever faster. For generations of Americans, it was a small, reliable pleasure that required no thought, no caution, no expectation beyond the simple enjoyment of taste. And yet, the story was nearing its culmination. The decades of refinement, scientific understanding, regulatory compliance, and cultural embedding had set the stage for the chocolate bar as we know it today, a reliable, beloved, and culturally iconic treat. Its journey from mildly stimulating curiosity to soothing staple was nearly complete, and the final chapter would reflect not just on the product itself, but on the quiet evolution of consumer expectation, corporate discipline, and the enduring comfort of consistency. By the 1980s, the Hershey chocolate bar had transcended mere confectionery status and had quietly cemented itself as a cultural fixture. It wasn't flashy, it didn't promise grand effects, and it certainly didn't compete for attention in a world of neon lights, booming pop culture, and ever-expanding consumer choices. Yet that was exactly the point. Its power lay in its predictability, its reliability, and its comforting familiarity. In a rapidly changing society, the simple act of unwrapping a Hershey bar became a minor ritual that provided reassurance. It was a small pause in the chaos of daily life, and a tactile reminder that some things remained steady, unshakable, and delightfully simple. Over the decades, the chocolate bar had undergone subtle but profound transformation. In its earliest days, the combination of cocoa, sugar, and incidental compounds, sometimes including naturally occurring stimulants, gave it an unpredictable character. These variations were minor, yet they added a layer of complexity to the chocolate that few consumers recognized consciously. The effects were gentle, unremarkable, yet historically significant, because they reflected a time when industrial processes, supply chains, and scientific understanding were still evolving. Hershey's chocolate carried traces of a world that was learning to define and control its ingredients, a world where consistency was not yet a priority. As years passed, the company's meticulous attention to quality control reshaped the chocolate into a product defined by predictability. By the mid-20th century, every bar, every batch, and every shipment had been refined to exacting standards. Cocoa beans were sourced from approved suppliers, roasted under controlled conditions, and processed in factories that monitored every detail. Temperatures, moisture content, particle size, all were carefully measured and documented. By the 1980s, accidental variations in taste or chemical composition were virtually non-existent. The chocolate's character was no longer influenced by the serendipity of global transport or the occasional botanical trace from a distant plantation. Instead, it embodied deliberate design, smooth, sweet, dependable, and comforting. This evolution mirrored societal changes. Consumers increasingly expected consistency and safety in their food. Nutritional awareness had grown, regulations had tightened, and transparency was no longer optional. Hershey's had anticipated these demands long before they became widespread. The company's systems, practices, and culture were designed to meet or exceed public expectations. As a result, Hershey's chocolate became not just a treat, but a symbol of trust. Families could rely on it, workers could rely on it, and even the most cautious consumer could enjoy it without hesitation. Culturally, the chocolate bar had integrated itself into everyday life in a manner that was almost ritualistic. Children unwrapped them in classrooms, sharing squares as tokens of friendship and minor celebration. Adults kept them tucked into desks and drawers, a reward for enduring the monotony of office life or a comforting treat during long commutes. Holidays, birthdays, and family gatherings often featured Hershey's chocolate, not because it was extravagant, but because it was universally familiar. Its flavor, texture, and character provided a shared sensory language that crossed generations. A bar bought in the 1980s tasted remarkably similar to the bars enjoyed by soldiers during wartime decades earlier, or the treats tucked into lunchboxes in the 1950s. This continuity was subtle but powerful.
Meanwhile, the broader chocolate industry had taken notice. Companies experimenting with novelty, stimulants, or exotic flavors often found their products less enduring. Consumers appreciated excitement, but they valued predictability even more. Hershey's approach, focusing on precision, safety, and consistent pleasure, proved remarkably resilient. By controlling every variable in the production process, the company ensured that its chocolate would meet expectations every single time. In a market full of gimmicks and changing trends, that reliability became a competitive advantage. Inside the factories, the culture of meticulousness continued. Workers understood that even small lapses in temperature, timing, or ingredient ratios could affect the final product. Yet these factories weren't cold or mechanical in an unwelcoming sense. They carried a quiet rhythm, a meditative quality. Machines hummed with confidence, employees moved with practiced calm. Every bar that rolled off the assembly line represented decades of accumulated knowledge, careful observation, and disciplined refinement. It was precision with purpose, executed so seamlessly that the end consumer experienced only the simplicity of taste and texture, not the complexity behind it. Even the marketing of the era emphasized subtlety over spectacle. Hershey's didn't need to promise invigoration, exotic flavors, or strange new sensations. Instead, advertisements focused on comfort, nostalgia, and shared moments. The messaging reinforced the chocolate bar as a reliable companion, a gentle reward, and a source of small but meaningful pleasure. Television commercials, print ads, and store displays all highlighted these values, reflecting the societal desire for stability and reassurance. In a world saturated with flash and overstimulation, Hershey's chocolate stood quietly, confidently, and persistently consistent. By now, decades of refinement, research, and social integration had transformed the chocolate bar into more than food. It had become an emotional anchor. A square of Hershey chocolate was a brief escape, a moment of calm, a personal ritual. Consumers didn't need to consider its history, its scientific precision, or its cultural significance. They simply enjoyed it. Yet each bite carried the legacy of over a century of careful craftsmanship, supply chain management, and scientific understanding. What seemed effortless was the result of intentional design. Looking back, the evolution of Hershey's chocolate is remarkable not because of dramatic innovations, but because of patient, steady progress. Early bars contained subtle stimulants, traces of exotic plant compounds, and unpredictable variations. Over decades, each of these variables was analyzed, understood, and refined. Production methods were perfected, quality controls were integrated, supply chains were standardized. And in the process, the chocolate bar became entirely predictable, safe, and consistently enjoyable. It was, in every sense, a product of history, shaped by societal demands, scientific progress, and the quiet vision of a company committed to excellence. And yet, perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Hershey's chocolate is its emotional impact. A bar might be unremarkable to a casual observer, yet it provides moments of reassurance and calm in lives filled with noise and unpredictability. Children, workers, families, and even travelers experienced a small, reliable pleasure, a ritual repeated daily, weekly, and across generations. Hershey's chocolate became a touchstone, a reminder that despite the complexities of life, there exist constants that are dependable, comforting, and quietly satisfying. By the end of the 20th century, the Hershey chocolate bar had fully realized its identity. No longer an experimental, mildly stimulating confection, it had become a symbol of comfort, predictability, and cultural continuity. Its flavor, texture, and gentle sweetness carried a legacy that spanned decades and touched countless lives. And though the accidental compounds, exotic ingredients, and minor unpredictabilities of the past were gone, the chocolate retained a subtle magic, the ability to offer reassurance, a moment of calm, and a shared ritual in a fast-moving world. In this way, Hershey's chocolate stands as more than a treat. It is a lesson in patience, refinement, and quiet consistency. It demonstrates the power of meticulous care, thoughtful adaptation, and long-term vision. And most importantly, it reminds us that sometimes the simplest pleasures, perfectly predictable, reliably sweet, and gently comforting, can have the deepest impact on our lives. A Hershey bar is more than chocolate. It is history, culture, science, and comfort, all wrapped in a familiar paper sleeve. It is a small, unassuming anchor in a world that never stops moving, and as long as it exists, generations of people can take solace in that unchanging, sweet, dependable presence.
And with that, the story of Hershey's chocolate comes full circle. From mildly stimulating curiosity to meticulously refined staple, from unpredictable early batches to globally recognized symbol of comfort, from exotic beginnings to the unshakable familiarity of today. It is a story of adaptation, patience, and timeless indulgence, a story that continues quietly in the hands of anyone who unwraps a simple square and takes a bite.